Welcome to this online lesson looking at continued settlement of the West, seeking their fortune, the Exodusters, the Oklahoma land rush, and later settlement of the West. The aims are to know examples of later settlement, to explain similarities and differences between groups of settlers, and to evaluate the significance of later settlement of the West. Firstly, the Exoduster movement. You might want to note this down as a subheading now. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. The thing is, this was right in the middle of the American Civil War, and so it didn't really take effect until after the war and after the southern states had rejoined the Union. In 1865, the Civil War ended and the slaves in the South were freed too. But by 1879, the slaves were little better off. They were often still in their slave shacks working for their former masters. The promise of land and farms in Kansas led to an exodus west, partially inspired by the biblical exodus of Moses. Your tasks then: watch the linked video and then read the linked website article. Then describe who the Exodusters were, when they were active, where they went, and what they did and why they migrated. Then, as an extension, how likely was it that the Exodusters would find a better life in Kansas? Use point example explain to explain your answer. You might want to pause the video now so you can study that article and watch that video. Pause now. Okay, so here's some of the findings that you should have got. The Exodusters were freed slaves, led by a man called Pap Singleton, who helped organise the Exodus. They were active from 1879 onwards after a false promise of a free land in Kansas. So that's why they ended up going to Kansas. So what they did is they organised and saved up to travel to the state of Kansas and set up their own homesteads. Although the promise of free land was turned out not to be true, they were still able to make applications under the Homestead Act, and that's precisely what many of them did. So how likely was it that they were better off? Well, actually, for many of them, quite likely. After all, they wouldn't have been living under the regime of their former slave masters, which was always going to be a very difficult relationship, to say the least. Not only that, many of the people working for their former slave masters would have been working as sharecroppers. This meant that although they weren't technically slaves, they were still very much tied to their masters and didn't actually receive cash pay. Instead, they would receive a portion of the produce that they grew as a share of the crop, which they could then keep or sell. So, in terms of increasing the amount of freedom and being able to strike out on their own and re-establish their lives, the Exodusters very likely were better off in Kansas. That's not to say that it was necessarily an easy trip and that they didn't face discrimination in Kansas, because they absolutely would do. So how do we kind of summarise the Exoduster movement in a very short and memorable way? What you're going to do is you're going to complete a table like this. On it, I've got two of the other mass migrations that we've looked at so far. You could as well add the gold rush to this table if you wanted to. For one, we've got the Mormons. They migrated between 1846 and 47. Where? Well, they went to the Salt Lake City, Utah, or rather the Salt Lake Valley, which they later established as Salt Lake City. And why? Because they were escaping religious persecution. Then we've got the Homesteaders. They're moving out west from 1862 onwards. Where? To the territories on the Great Plains. And why? To set up farms using the Homestead Act of 1862. 160 acres granted if you farmed it for 5 years. So, how would you complete this table for the Exodusters? I'd recommend writing out the table in full, leaving space for the Exodusters, and leaving a further space for our next example too. Fill out the table now. Okay. So here's what you should have got in there. The Exodusters, in terms of when, was 1879. Where did they go? Well, they went to settle in farmland in Kansas. And why? Because they were basically moving on as freed slaves to try and sort out their own lives in freedom. And you might have also added that they were led by Pap Singleton. Alright, so that's the Exoduster movement. A real short summary then of who they were and when they moved. An interesting, if little known, part of settlement of the later West. Now for our next example, the Oklahoma land rush of 1893. In 1893, land that had been taken from the Indians in Oklahoma was opened up to settlement. Potential homesteaders staked claims on pieces of land effectively on a first-come, first-served basis. This is one of the last significant episodes of mass settlement of the West. So, like we did last time, watch the link video and then read the link website article. Then go through the similar process. Who took part in the land rush? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And what did the settlers do? And why did the land rush happen as it did? Then as an extension, have a think about this. Is the Oklahoma land rush symbolic of the end of the Plains Indians' freedom on the plains? Have a think about that and then complete your answer. Pause the video now. Okay, some of the findings that you should have come up with. In terms of the who took part, it was anyone who could afford a homestead claim and wanted to strike out west and establish a homestead of their own. However, one of the things about this is that it was first come, first served. You can see in the photograph that there is a rush over the border of people rushing to get the best and most choice bits of land. But as you probably saw in the video, some people had illegally slipped through the army pickets overnight and had already snuck out and taken the very best choice bits of land. So not everyone was a winner from this. When did it happen? Well, it happened in 1893, as we've seen. Where did it happen? And it happened in the Oklahoma Territory, which was formerly Indian Territory. It's this idea of really closing the Indian frontier once and for all. This sort of no man's land between different Indian reservations had up until this point not been up for grabs for the homesteaders and settlers, but now it was. And why? Because really by this point the Plains Indians' way of life had been utterly destroyed. This is after the battle, or rather massacre, at Wounded Knee. It is after the Dawes Act, and it is after all the other things that were done to the Indians that effectively stopped them having their free and nomadic lifestyle on the plains. So, why did it happen as it did? Effectively, this is an example of a land free-for-all and a land grab. These people were establishing their homesteads on a first-come, first-served basis. And so perhaps, given what we've looked at there in terms of the why, this is symbolic of the end of the Indians' freedom on the plains. Although arguably, probably a better symbol of that is what happened at Wounded Knee, which really does seem to spell the death knell of Indian independence. Okay, we're going to move on. Now it's time to add the Oklahoma land rush to our table, so hopefully you left some space. Add the Oklahoma land rush to your table now. Okay, here are the basics of what you should have included. When? 1893. Where? Oklahoma Territory. And why? Well, we've got 100,000 settlers who are staking claims for homesteads on former Indian land on a first-come, first-served basis. You will need to remember more than this, so ensure that if you are unhappy with your notes or if you're not using this lesson just as a revision activity, you go back over those articles and you make some more substantive notes as well. So, here we're going to work on our exam skills again. And yes, it's yet another narrative account question. I make no apology for this. They are one of the trickier sorts of questions. And by looking at the exams analysis for the last couple of years, it tends to be one of the areas where pupils can pick up some easy marks, but they're regularly failing to do so. Let's consider the question. Write a narrative account analysing the ways in which settlement in the West developed in the years 1876 to 95. 8 marks. Again, remember, a narrative account is like a story. It should be told in order. Remember, think about a narrator like what I'm doing now. They're telling and explaining a story. However, we can't just leave it there. This story has to be analysing the ways in which settlement in the West developed in the years 1876 to 95. So by analysing, we're talking about explaining the links and explaining why it happened as it did. If you don't get those bits of explanation in, you are going to fail to pick up most of the AO2 marks. So pay attention to the mark scheme that I've included here. Your answer should have a clear narrative with events in a clear chronological order. If you don't have this, then it's unlikely your answer will flow together well. Then the links between the events should be fully explained and analysed, so you should see how one event can lead to the next. Then the outcome of events can be explained and backed up in a conclusion. And then lastly, your knowledge should be accurate and it should show a good understanding of the topic. Now, one of the tricks here is that we've just looked at the Oklahoma land rush of 1893, and earlier than that, we've had a look at the Exodusters. But those two events are not actually very well linked together. So it's not as if you could say, firstly, there was the Exoduster movement, and then there was the Oklahoma land rush. The challenge here is you're going to have to think of something else which unites those two things, maybe by way of a theme, or links them in some other way. Consider then this extra stimulus material. You may use the following in your answer: the end of the Civil War, the closing of the Indian frontier. You must also use information of your own. Remember, with this stimulus material, you could use it, and arguably you should use it because we know it will be relevant, or you could still get full marks even if you don't mention it. On the other hand, you must use at least some of your own knowledge. So, take a moment or two to plan out an answer and sketch out a plan. You should spend between 12 and 15 minutes on this question unless you're entitled to extra time. So when you're ready, you can make a start. Pause the video now. Okay, let's have a look at an example answer. Hopefully you didn't find that too tricky. Write a narrative account analysing the ways in which settlement in the West developed in the years 1876 to 95. 8 marks. Well, as you can see what I've done, I've colour-coded my point in red, my examples in green, and where I've added extra detail or explanation, that's in blue. The most important bit though is in purple. This is my analysis where I'm linking it back to the question in terms of it being a narrative account analysing the ways in which settlement developed. So the structure goes point, example, explain, and then link, or PEEL for short. After the end of the Civil War in 1866, many slaves still faced racism living on the plantations where they had worked on as slaves. This led to Benjamin Singleton starting the Exoduster movement, where former slaves migrated to Kansas territory. This developed settlement in the West because it led to black people moving to Kansas to set up their own farms like the homesteaders, rather than working on former slave plantations. Okay, so could be tricky to see how I link it to the next one, so let's see how I do it. Later, homesteading and settlement expanded further as a result of Indian land being made available for settlement. Okay, so my link here is the common theme of homesteading. Now, it's difficult to link this in terms of causation, but to consider them both from a wider point of view of the issue of homesteading is actually a way around that. An example of this was the Oklahoma land rush of 1893. Potential homesteaders rushed to stake the best claims in April 1893, rapidly expanding the population of Oklahoma Territory. This helped develop settlement in the West because 100,000 people rushed into Oklahoma, leading to the rapid establishment of new homesteads and even new settlements like Oklahoma City. Alright, let's see what I can include as another example. Well, this is where I look at how homesteading is actually linked to the decline of Indian land. However, the settlement of Oklahoma was the result of unfair treatment of the Indians. By the 1890s, Indians had been moved onto reservations. This meant that Indian land was available to be settled by homesteaders. This developed settlement of the West, as it meant that more land was available to be settled by homesteaders who would farm the plains, changing them forever. Now to tie it all together in a conclusion. The most important reason settlement developed was because the Indians had been moved onto reservations. This opened up land for homesteading, making both the Exoduster movement and the Oklahoma land rush possible. This developed settlement of the West by converting some of the last remaining plains land to homestead farming. So what I've done here is I've taken two quite different examples of later settlement and united them under the common theme of the Indians having had the land taken off of them. And that's how I've got around those differences. So, based upon that, have a look at your own answer and compare it to mine. Are there any improvements that you can make? If so, you can do that now, and then estimate what sort of grade you'll get. Remember, you can skip back a couple of minutes in the video to have a look at the mark scheme as well in order to help you with that. And remember, you cannot get level 3 unless you're including your own knowledge as well. One last piece of advice, I've picked out in bold some of my linking phrases, things like this, led to, later, and however, and make sure that you're using words like that as well to show that your answer kind of flows on and you are making those deliberate links between events. And on that note, as long as you've improved your answer, that's the end of the lesson. I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been useful, and even though it's been quite a short video. And if it has been useful, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'd be very, very grateful. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.